All right, excellent. I think everything is set here for the episode. Good morning to those of you watching the video live, which actually is none of you because I'm not streaming it live. But I'm going to keep up the conceit of video streaming live, and then someday I will have the wherewithal to actually do it. So just pretend that there's a live audience. Anyway, today's episode is called 3 Walks in London and Associated Thoughts. I just got back from London. I was there for a work trip. And, because I was there for work, I didn't have a whole lot of time to do anything really except work. But I did make time in the evening once, or I woke up early enough twice to get out for a walk. And I'm glad I did, because if I hadn't done that, all I would have done is gone to the office and then back to the hotel. And I love London. I always have, ever since I was a very young boy. And it's always been a place that has just been, I don't know. I think it's a beautiful city, and I lived there for a year as a student, and it certainly changed when I lived there as a student. Put that in quotation marks. I realized that was 30 years. It was a long time ago. It was 88, 87, 88. There was a presidential election going on between George H.W. Bush and Michael Dukakis, so that can date it for you. I must have come back. I must have been back for the fall of that election. So I've been back in the fall of 88. So I was there fall of 87 to summer of 88. Is that right? Sounds right. Anyway, the area that I was for work, the Canary Wharf, there was nothing there. I mean, it really was still just abandoned docks. There was nothing there. If you went on a trip to Greenwich, on the other side from, if you go see the Naval Observatory, or the clock that's got the zero meridian in it, I mean, nothing there, and now it's like Manhattan. I mean, it's very dense and with office space, and that's where the headquarters, or the European headquarters of the company that I work for is. So I was there, and then my hotel was just across the river by the Millennium Dome, which is now called something different. Again, that wasn't there. That wasn't there until, well, I mean, the Millennium, right? Well, I guess it was late, so it didn't get done until 2002 or whatever. The trip was short notice, so I wasn't paying a lot of attention when I made my travel arrangements, and I just looked for, and I don't know the area, so I looked for a hotel that was close to what I knew was the office. And the travel site said, well, this hotel is 0.25 miles away. And I thought, well, that's great. Then when I got there on Sunday, I flew in on Sunday to be there for Monday morning. So it's quite late Sunday by the time I got from Heathrow through the underground to the office. And in my mind, I was like, it's a quarter of a mile from One Canada Square, which I know is the Canary Wharf underground stop. So I got off, and then I pulled out my phone and said, okay, where's this hotel? I expected it to be, a 5-minute walk. And said it was a 90-minute walk. 90 minutes. So holy shit! What? I'm in the wrong part of the country. But it turns out that it is a quarter mile, but it's across the river, and there's actually no pedestrian path. So the route was down one side and then over and then up the other side. So, I got back on the tube and took the stop to North Greenwich, which was the correct stop. And then once there, it was easy to get to the hotel. So I was there for 5 days, and one of the things I started to do was put together a YouTube playlist of songs that I would listen to when I was there, as a student. So I was a college student. I was in my junior year in college, so I would have been 19, I guess, 20, 19 and 20. And music was very different than, not so much the music itself, although the music was certainly very different, I think, but the consumption of music was different. I had a Walkman, a cassette Walkman. A cassette Walkman was still not like, I mean, everyone had one, but it had only been a few years, right? Like in '88, when did the Walkman come out? I mean, it wasn't right away in the '80s, was it? It was probably, so the technology is still relatively new, and of course you had to have a cassette, which means you had to have a recording of the piece. So there was fewer songs that I listened to more often each. Although, to be honest, I still have a tendency to just listen to a few songs on repeat or in a cycle. But I can always switch that out now on my phone or whatever I'm listening to. So it was quite easy for me to put together a list of songs that I knew I'd listened to all the time because they were the only ones I had. And I put that on YouTube as a playlist. I'll share it in the show notes. It's things like Style Council, the Communards, all kinds of stuff. But not even like Whitney Houston. Right? When I think of, I have another playlist that I listen to when I get a little bit too drunk, and I just like to listen to songs that I think of as being the younger me. But like Whitney Houston, I Will Always Love You, came out years after I came back from there, because I'd graduated from college. But from this perspective, those 2 to 3 years at the time felt like an eternity. Of course, it wasn't. And I wonder, as I was a couple of times while I was there this trip, I felt a bit disoriented, not just because there was jet lag and I was working and I wasn't sure where I was, but that year I spent was very formative for me, and I wonder what my 19-year-old self would have thought if they had met me, the 50-year-old me. I felt that particularly when I was listening to this playlist, and I was, it was a night when I was tired, and I'd had a couple of beers, and so I was a bit dozy or doozy. I thought, well, what if I had? What if that has happened? Not just as an exercise in thought, but like an exercise in reality. What if, who knows how things work, particularly in London, which is a very strange space. It's so old, right? People have been living there for a long time and doing the same thing in the same part of that. I'll talk more about why I like taking walks, and particularly walks where I get a little bit lost. So that's a psychogeographic aspect of the podcast, right? And some part of me, I think, thinks of every place as London in the same way that William Blake thought of every place as like Jerusalem. I think there's sort of a medium of imagined location or a shared location that you get into when you've gone for a long walk. And the word that comes to mind for me often is scour. Like on each of the times that I got out for a walk this past week, it was not something I wanted to do. I went out Monday, which was my first full day of work, and I was exhausted. But I knew I had the time after finishing the office. It was, and then on Wednesday morning, it was early, and I was tired because I was just tired. So, and then on the last morning, on Friday morning, on the way out to the airport, or on the day I needed to get to the airport, I had the morning free, and I was going to take some time there. And in that case, I was anxious about getting to the airport, and you'll hear when I talk about it how there's a point where you leave, and then there's a point where everything goes away. It reminds me of last episode where I talked about Seamus Heaney at the frontier of writing, where there's, intense scrutiny and an intense challenge, and then you pass through it, and you're into something different. And there's always a sense of that in the long walking. I call it long walking. None of these, well, the third one was close to 10 miles, but the others were more like 5 to 6 miles, so not super long. But in context, there was a bit of a pressure point to it. So why don't I stop yapping away and lay out the 3 walks and then talk about each of them a little bit. So first walk, Isle of Dogs through the Greenwich Foot Tunnel back to my hotel. So that's the first walk, and this was Monday. I'd arrived Sunday evening. I'd worked Monday, and then about 5:30 we packed up, which was good because I was ready to fall asleep. And I really, I knew I had limited time, and I thought, all right, I'm going to take that walk, the phone route, the Google Maps had suggested, to get there, and see what I see. I don't know that part of the city. I don't know whether I'm going to see places that I recognize, if there are famous landmarks or anything, if it's residential or what have you. So it took me probably about 20 minutes to get oriented, just literally walking out of the office and knowing whether to make a left or a right. I went in a bit of a circle. I'm going to take the Google timeline snapshots for each of these walks and put them on a web page so you can see the routes that I took. And you'll see on this Monday one that I'm really just struggling to figure out which way is up and down, literally which way is the river, so I can get to it. I went out the door. I think there's a street called South Colonnade, and I was looking for different bridges across the canals because there's still canals, or at least dock wharfs built into the structure of Canary Wharf. Many of them were filled in to build the city, and none of them are really working docks now in terms of boats coming in, although you can get your yacht or houseboat or whatever in and out. But there are some cool bridges, the little footbridges that go across, and once I'd got through some of those, then there's actually I'm getting ahead of myself. Then there was a couple miles basically just straight down the Isle of Dogs, Canary Wharf, straight down to get to the crossing point, to get on the other side, the south side of the river, and then back up towards the hotel, which again was next door to the O2, to the Millennium. And I think the neighborhood that I walked through is called Tower Hamlet, which is a name I recognize. And I saw parks called Tower Hamlet Park, so I'm assuming that I walked through Tower Hamlet. But what struck me for that first section was that I caught sight of a little gate to a side path, and I figured it seemed to run parallel to the road. So rather than walk down the road, I would walk down the path, and if I even needed to, I could double back and get back on or whatever. But it turned out that it took me maybe a half mile or a mile, I don't know, parallel to the road, and it was a path called the Mudchute Farm. And right in the middle of what is surely the most sought-after real estate in London, as far as office building, is this farm, and then community allotments, each of them with these colorful sheds, and they're beautifully maintained allotments. It looked like a little hobbit garden, a large hobbit garden actually, and then fields. After walking for even just a minute or two, I had to turn around and take a picture because off in the distance were the skyscrapers and the office buildings. But I was looking through trees and sort of this farmland. It looked like a fairy, sort of a fae, not quite real place. So when I talk about the frontier of writing like that, it's when it clicked. Okay, I'm going to have a walk now. I noticed. I knew then. Okay, this is the right thing to be doing, because I've seen this farm and it's surprised me, and it's shaken me out of just thinking I'm going to trudge along here and get where I need to get or do what I said I would do. Instead, it's like, look, if I pay attention, I'm going to see these weird alignments and anomalies. Probably everybody within 20 miles knows that that's there, and probably people take their dogs there. I don't know what they do, but to me, it was this sort of uprising of a sweet mystery. It was just as if I'd wandered into the Shire or something. So and then I walked away from it, and then I got back onto a main road. And again, I'm following my phone, but I got onto something called the Thames Path, and what it did was it took me to the river, and there was this sort of domed building, and I thought, that's really a cool building. I wonder what the hell that is. And I looked around and wandered, and I kept seeing people ride in on their bicycles, jog in. And I thought, what the hell are they doing there? And it turns out that the route took me in there because it's a foot tunnel. It was also entirely surprising, but there's a foot tunnel. It's not very big. I mean, it's plenty big enough for people to walk through, and it's not like you're claustrophobic or anything, but it's quite long. It goes under the frickin' river, and people would run through, or they'd ride their bikes through. And it was another sort of strange transition. There were a lot of sort of metal gratings on the floor. I guess presumably if it ever, I don't know, it's a drain. I don't know what would happen if it had broken. Well, I know what would happen. You'd be dead. It would be a shitty way to go. Fuck. But whenever people would ride over on their bikes, which they weren't supposed to, by the way, there was a sign saying don't ride your bikes, push them, but people rode along anyway. And they would go over these ramps, and it would sort of make a big thumping, echoing sound. And they're all doing it. So the whole tunnel, while you're walking through it, is reverberating with these metallic thumps and echoes. At first I thought it was coming from outside, like if you were on a boat and could hear whale song through the hull of the boat. I thought, well, maybe this is the sound of the river through the bedrock, or whatever it is. But no, I think it was just people riding over those grates. It's a very strange sound. I wish I'd had the gumption to take my phone out and record it. But, well. And then when you come out the other side, it's right by the Cutty Sark, which is a very famous boat. Although it's burned down a few years ago and they rebuilt it, so I'm not sure why people make a big deal out of it anymore. It's just a model, big one, whatever. Not something that particularly interests me, but there you go. And it's and then the trail then on the south side of the river. I'm saying that. I hope that's the right way to describe it. It's on the other side. Heads back east, I guess, northeast, I don't know, towards the Millennium Dome. And for a lot of that distance, it's very well populated. Again, all kinds of bicyclists. But actually, the last couple of miles of it were right down by the river. Like, they clearly didn't want you to go over onto the sandbars and little beaches. But the Thames, is tidal. And there's little beaches. People surely go down there. I wasn't going to. So the last thing I wanted to do is get stuck in mud and then drown like a pirate by the banks of the Thames. But it was right there. And for a big chunk of it, it's sort of unlit, not particularly well maintained, as opposed to some of it, which was very posh and nicely maintained. So I got a bit nervous through some of those sections. And at a point where I knew I was about a mile away from the hotel, I noticed this green laser beam. I don't know what it was. I'm sure I could find out what it was, but look. It was a green laser beam shooting from the bank of the Thames way further away from where I was coming, right up into the sky, a couple of miles up. Whatever, for not a couple of miles, but it appeared to go above my head, right? I could see it when I looked up, and then I could follow it down like it was a rainbow. I could see where it was starting from. It's a very thin green light, and I've talked about that color green in one of the essays that I'm finishing up. I think I might have mentioned it on one of these podcasts as well. So the kinesthetic sensations of gesture, the gestures of death, creativity, and stillness. Anyway, the color of death is the exact neon green, and I described it sort of like this neural scattering in the sky. This vision that I had once walking in Pittsburgh with a perfectly rich black sky, stars in the sky, listening to some Messiaen, and then seeing this like a neural synapses network blasted out onto the sky. So maybe that's what it is to be dead. But more to come on that, right? Keep an eye out for the essays. I don't want to get on a tangent. But there was that exact color. But this looked like a wand or something, like some kind of wizardry activity. And the sky was, I was right down by the river. Like really, the water was 10 feet away from me. And it was dark where I was, but across the side of the river were the lights of these office buildings. And then in the middle of it was this freaking green laser beam. And I'm sure, anyone who's listening from London, you're like, oh, no, that's the blah, 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 blah. Ha, ha, ha. You think it's a wizard, been reading too much Harry Potter. Well, I haven't read too much Harry Potter because I don't read Harry Potter. I know what I saw. It was a laser beam. And I know that because then when you start to first see the O2, the Millennium Dome, it's an appalling building. I mean, it's this sort of squat half dome stuck on the side of the river. These bloody great big pylons pointing out of it. I mean, why would you think to build something that looks like that? Did it have to look like that? I don't know. Did those pylons do something? It looks like it's a structure that should form the basis for a larger structure. Maybe that's the idea, but it's fucking ugly, and it's sinister from a distance. You see this squat, bulbous thing that looks like a bubo, right? Like a plague, pus-filled plague boil that someone has tried to lance from every main direction to try to pierce it and not been able to, and then it's got spotlights on it and red warning lights all over the place. And from a distance, over the dark water and the sort of shadows of the footpath that I was on, it was terrifying. It's horrible. And then from the hotel, you can actually look out the window, and there it is, and it's not horrible, and it's not terrifying. It's just horrible. So, I'm really taking my time on this episode. I wonder if I need to break this into 3 episodes, three walks and associated thoughts, and like I did with the 4 influences. Maybe that's what I'm doing here, because that's just 20 minutes now, and I've got 2 more walks to do. No, I'm just going to keep going. It'll be a longer essay, a longer episode. In fact, the second walk, I don't have quite so much to say about the second walk. It was on the Wednesday morning. And think of it this way. Think of the first walk from the Isle of the Dogs, Canary Wharf, south, across the river, and then back up north. And maybe those directions aren't right, but like a big U. And the far point of the U is Greenwich, the Greenwich Observatory. And my hotel then, and the Millennium Dome, is about halfway between the Greenwich Observatory and the Thames Barrier. Now, the Thames Barrier has been there a long time. Since the 70s. I don't know. And it's these sort of bollards in the middle of the river. I think there's 6 of them, 4 of them. And between each of them are these huge scooped walls that can be lowered to block the upstream river from coming into the city so that the main part of the city doesn't flood, which has always been a big problem. And when it became catastrophic because of the confluence of modern technology, particularly the underground and the water, they needed to figure out a way to prevent it from happening. So I don't know how effective it is as the sea levels rise, but it's still effective enough now that they build it. And the shapes from a distance, so I could see this from the room that was in the hotel. I could look up the river, I guess down the river, and see these bollards in the river, and they're kind of a nice shape. They're sort of like cut parabola, or slices of parabolas in the river, and then I like the idea of the wall being scooped. It kind of rotates in and out. It doesn't go up and down. It rotates. And it would, so from the dome to the barrier is 2 and a bit miles. So it would be a nice round walk, right? And I thought I'll get up early enough in the morning that I can do that walk, get back, and then still be in the office for when I needed to start. So I did this on the Wednesday morning. I think a couple of things that stuck me on this walk. The first, the construction activity along the bank of the river there detoured me a bit, and so they're building new buildings still. At the time I was there, this thing called the airline, which is like a cable car that goes across to some state, I don't know, was closed for repairs, so there was a big set of construction that I wandered into, and then very kindly but very firmly was told to move out by a couple of security guards. I'm sure I just looked exactly like what it was, which was a bit of a dopey old man out for a dopey old walk with his dopey hat and his dopey coat. It was raining. This was a very good day for a walk. It was chilly, it was rainy, it was blustery. So I made it through that. I think the construction is around a place called Millennium Village. Again, people live there. So I walked through. And then there's a section that seems like it's still a working part of the river, with boats out a bit in the river, and then mechanical conveyor belts going out to them. I actually found a sign that told me what it was. It's a marine aggregate wharf, and so the boats are bringing sand and whatever that they've dredged from the ocean, and then it gets, on these conveyor belts into big piles, and then from there it's taken out to construction sites. And apparently when they filled in Canary Wharf to build on it, it was this kind of marine aggregate. So it's always good to see things actually working. I'm a bit confused by something they said. They said that they're dredging all of this stuff, 20 million tons or whatever, from the same small acreage of the UK coastline. So they were making a point that they weren't just sort of dredging up the ocean and killing everything. But surely if you dig a hole in the ocean, it's just going to fill in with, right? It's just going to, if I dug a hole in my yard, yeah, I've dug a hole and this taken soil away. But if it was in sand, I would dig a hole, and then the sand from outside the hole would just fall in, and You see what I'm saying? It's like I don't know that I could say, I'm only taking from this very narrow area of land, because in the sea, doesn't it work that way, that it all just falls in? I could just keep pumping it out, and gradually I would have it all. It would just keep coming. Then the barrier itself was impressive to get to. I think if I'd gone just a little bit further, there was a cafe or something, but I didn't have time to sit and have a coffee and ogle it. But I got to see the barrier, and I'd done the walk. And a lot of this, the importance of these is doing them and experiencing them. That walk in particular was good to clear my head, I think, is really the thing that it did. And get some exercise. Okay, so I was right. I'm not talking as much about that second walk, which is good, because I want to talk a fair bit about the third walk, which was out to Primrose Hill, and in particular to Chalcott Square in Primrose Hill. So this is the part of London that Sylvia Plath lived towards the end of her life. There are two houses out there associated with her. One is on Chalcott Square, which actually has the blue plaque, right, which is how historical sites are recognized in England. So I took a picture of that when I got there, and I did it very quickly because it's someone's house, right? So I'm not sure what the etiquette is. I'm sure I was breaking it. I'm sure sitting there and taking a picture. But someone came and took a picture of the front of my house. I guess I would wonder what they're looking at. In fact, that did happen once. Someone was outside taking a picture of our house. So we went out and asked, and it turns out it was a man and his family. He had lived here in the 60s or whenever. And it was his grandparents' house. So it was great. It was wonderful. We brought him in and showed him around. So maybe that's what would have happened if as I was taking a picture. But just the front window, I felt it really awkward, but I wanted to take a picture of it. So that's and then the second house is actually got a blue plaque because Yeats lived there. No, not Yeats, Keats. Close enough, right? One letter off. And Sylvia Plath lived in that house as well. That's on Fitzroy. So my plan had been, this was a Friday, so I knew I needed to get to the airport by noonish for my afternoon flight back home, leaving Heathrow, which gave me plenty of time at the airport to have a beer and some lunch. So I was thinking what I would do is from my hotel, I would take the tube up to the London Bridge and transfer to the Northern Line, and the Northern Line up to a station called Chalk Farm, which is right by where I wanted to be. Walk around a bit, and then there's a canal path that's about a half-hour walk from there right up to King's Cross. King's Cross, onto the Piccadilly line, out to Heathrow, Bob's your uncle. So I was planning on, I had my suitcase, right, and my suitcase was loaded up with stuff, and so I didn't want to necessarily do a long walk. And I thought a half hour, which is a mile and a half, along the canal, perfect. I got out, the tubes, they seem to be so busy all the time, which I guess they always were, but to the point where when I got to change to the Northern Line, I'd managed to get on the Jubilee line and get up there okay, but then to get down to the Northern Line was a bunch of steps, not escalators, but steps. So I was stumbling, my heart rate was getting high, and then the amount of people waiting to get on that train, and I had this big suitcase. I wigged out. I lost it. I turned around and I pushed my way back out of the platform, kind of breathing heavily, pushing everyone out, and just got out and got up to the surface. And then I had to figure out where the heck I was and what I was going to do. I had originally looked to see from the hotel to the house how far it was, and it was, a 2.5, 3 hour walk, so I knew I didn't have time to do that. But okay, so by now I was in the city, so I knew I didn't have that far to go. And I checked again on the distance, and it looked like, 4 or 5 miles, 90 minutes to get there, 30 minutes back into King's Cross. It was still only 8:30, I was plenty of time. So I just said, okay, I'm going to do the walk. I'm going to do it anyway. Part of me wanted to just sit now by the river for a couple of hours, get some tea, maybe start drinking early. I didn't want to do that because I wanted to get to the airport. But, I thought I could still have a good time if I gave up. But it would have been that. It would have been giving up, and I didn't want to give up. And this third walk talks about another aspect of these walking, which, why do it? Well, or why do things? Why do things? I don't think doing a thing itself has any meaning, but doing a thing because you have decided it is important or because it honors an inspiration is important. So connecting an action to a commitment to the creative inspiration, whatever that is important. And this was a commitment to that creative inspiration. I am quite attached to Sylvia Plath's poetry, and have been since a summer when I was recuperating from one of the surgeries I keep talking about. And after one of them, I started reading poetry in a way that I'd never really had. I'd read poetry before. I'd even ham-fistedly written poetry as a young person. But all of a sudden, the language of the poet was the only language that seemed to make sense. I was looking for language that helped me digest an experience, right? And then from there, interested in poetry that helped me digest any experience, or called forth an experience, or described the experience, made it manifest. All of that, right? And both Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath were some of the first poets that I came into relationship with. I know that's an inelegant way of describing it, but they were poets whose work just resonated. At the same time I read Philip Larkin and Auden, so not really the same style. There's not a style I was talking about. They were all alive at roughly the same time, and maybe that was part of how I arrived at them in the first place. But I left that summer with kind of a real connection to all of them, but Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes in particular. Because their poetry is so vividly about the experience, and whatever the experience is, with Plath, it's the experience of being alive and being dead, or being alive and the mortality of death, the physicality of death, but also so many of her poems have these tender evocations of a moment with her children, or she wrote some beautiful nature poetry before Ariel, before that book. And I guess she wrote Ariel in the Fitzroy Street house that I went to. So I knew that I wanted to do it, but I was so anxious about the effort of doing it, right? I used to run marathons, and I felt that don't take that anymore. Don't take that as thinking that I was an athlete of any kind. I would take the time to train, and I took it very seriously. But a 4-hour marathon was a limit that I breached only once. A superhuman act. So, but the idea of these long training runs, 18 miles, 20 miles. I felt the same way as I was starting this walk as I did when I would settle in for a marathon training. There's nothing else you're going to do now except step by step. I wasn't entirely sure where I was going. I had this awful suitcase with me. It's an old suitcase. It's not very easy to maneuver. It does have wheels, thankfully, so I wasn't carrying it. But it's 50 pounds. It's filled with all kinds of British shampoo stuff that I was bringing back for my wife and daughter. I had a backpack with 2 laptops and a bunch of stuff. So I knew it was going to be hard graft to get out there. So here's what it was. From the London Bridge, I walked maybe a mile directly down the street. I probably could have gotten to the river at that point, but I got to the Waterloo Bridge, crossed Waterloo Bridge, and then that was the decision point. I stood there for a few minutes and thought, I'm either going to do this or I'm not. I'm either going to do this or I'm not going to do it. And if I don't do it, I would regret it, but I wouldn't be consumed with regret. And I would certainly have a good time sitting by the river. I might even have bought a pack of cigarettes. I might have got a nice Americano and found some tobacco, rolled a cigarette, and then gotten to the airport much earlier. And I knew that once I was through security, I was going to sit down and have a beer. But so I walked, and I just and after I made that decision, after about 10 or 15 minutes, the same thing that happened on the walk back, all of that sort of sloppiness about intention, and all of that sort of lack of there's a word I'm trying to think of. It's not fluid. sort of formlessness, all of that went away, and I wasn't tired, and I was absolutely enjoying myself. One of the things that I noticed for these walks is that at no point did it occur to me to put my headsets in. When I walk my dog at home and I'm out for half an hour or whatever, I always have headsets in, usually listen to podcasts or news or something like that. Never once did that. And so the walk from the bridge, once I'd crossed over, now I'm right. I know that area quite well because I went to King's College, which is right there on the embankment, and that corner I remember all the time. It was just maybe 100 yards or whatever down the Strand was the King's College building, the music building that I was in. And the student union was there, where we always congregated. And then this corner and across Waterloo, I did that walk all the time. I loved it. The South Bank was there. So I knew where I was. I guess Trafalgar Square was to the left, but I was north, right up. So it's kind of between then Covent Garden and all of that. So I didn't actually go into Covent Garden, but I knew I was up there. And I just kept walking. I passed Euston. I knew where that was, so these were points that I recognized. And then passing on from Euston was, I knew then that I was really I was in the sphere of the final destination at that point. There was no question that I was going to go there. And I'd passed through these different phases. The tube ride from the hotel to London Bridge, the aborted attempt to change onto the tube, which turns out to have been absolutely the right thing. I mean, I think that although it felt at the time like I was panicked and losing focus, what it really was that the nature of the walk itself refused to let me go on that train because I had to do the walk. I had to do the full walk. And once I'd gotten across Euston, then it was a straight line, basically, up past Russell Square. Again, I didn't go in. It was on the side of it, so I didn't see the British Museum, but I know it's right there. And then up kind of into Camden, which I didn't, right? And is that where Primrose Hill's really part of Camden? It sure is on the way back. You just go down a little bit, and then you're on the canal, and then you walk right through Camden Lock and Camden Market. That's a cool part of the city. I could see myself being very happy settling in there if I had £3 million to buy a house or whatever it is to live there now. And once we got the beautiful park, Regent's Park is off again. I didn't go there, and I was sort of traversed it, right? So then in Primrose Hill, Chalcott Square, very beautiful. Obviously now very upscale. Squares and cul-de-sacs. There's a park with a telephone. And okay, so I'm going to read you a poem at the end of all of this, and it's a long poem. And it's going to bump up this podcast episode by a while. So when I start reading the poem, you can skip to the end, because it's all that's going to be left. But in this poem, there's a telephone box that's described, and I walked, and I saw it in the distance. I thought, I wonder if that's the telephone box that's described in this poem. It could be. It was right between where I was and where I needed to get to. I didn't spend any time there. I didn't sit. Like at the Glenn Gould's grave, I did Chud. I didn't feel the need to do anything like that here. I just sat for a few minutes, took a break, and then walked down to King's Cross and got out to Heathrow. So the poem I'm going to read is called Last Letter, written by Ted Hughes. And it was discovered, or at least published after his death, kept separate, and it was written a long time ago, kept separate from the collection called Birthday Letters, which are poems that he had written through his life, immediately after Sylvia Plath's death. Not intended to be published, right? I mean, I'm not going to get into the biography of Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath. Just take it that there was a long and complicated biography with Ted Hughes at the center of an argument around Sylvia Plath's legacy in terms of publishing her poems, but also accusations of his responsibility for her death. And he addresses a lot of this in those poems, birthday letters, but they were written contemporary to the event. I mean, one of the side podcasts I've always thought about doing is taking my readings of each of those poems and talking through them, because they're quite I'm going to say wonderful, but it's a stupid word in this context. They're in some ways they hardly read like poems at all. They read like, no, I don't even know what that means. They are extraordinary. They're exquisite in the sense of a razor blade being exquisite. Exquisite analysis of memory and emotion, and how a thing can prompt a memory, and what that memory might be. So, yeah, it is all about this relationship and this the sadness of loss and death, and how that stays with a person. How grief never goes. So this poem, The Last Letter, was unearthed, and I forget the details of whether I think his widow's name is Carol, whether she was directed to maybe in executing a will to find a publication for this poem, or if it was discovered in some other papers. Anyway, Melvin Bragg, back in 2010, 2011, which I think was a couple years after Ted Hughes had died, which in turn was only not even a year after Birthday Letters were actually published, found this poem, this last letter, and it's the day when he finds out, when Sylvia Plath dies, when she kills herself. And you can just feel how, there are moments that you have to be relived, hoping to have them come out different. Right? Not just Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath. Everybody has those moments, and you can't help but think about them and just eyeball them. And did they happen? Can I stop them? Not wishing that they could turn different, but actually thinking, can I make it happen differently now? Not desire to make it happen, the belief that I could make it happen, and then it doesn't. The same thing happens again. There's a wonderful video Bill Drummond, sorry, it took me a minute to get his name. Bill Drummond took a copy of Birthday Letters with him on a train across India. And he talks about this in the video. And he periodically would read the poem, tear it out of the book, and then make a paper aeroplane and throw it out the window on this train ride across India. Beautiful. Okay, so I'm going to read this. You can hear it's 4 pages. It's probably going to take me 10 minutes to get through this. So I'm going to say my thank yous now, and all the usual stuff I say about subscription and newsletters. I'll say that. If you want to hear me read the poem, stick around, and if not, thank you for listening, and I'll catch up with you next week. Okay, so here it is. Last Letter by Ted Hughes. What happened that night? Your final night. Double, treble exposure over everything. Late afternoon, Friday, my last sight of you alive, burning your letter to me in the ashtray with that strange smile. Had I bungled your plan? Had it surprised me sooner than you purposed? Had I rushed it back to you too promptly, 1 hour later you would have been gone where I could not have traced you. I would have turned from your locked red door that nobody would open, still holding your letter, a thunderbolt that could not earth itself. That would have been electroshock treatment for me, repeated over and over all weekend as often as I read it or thought of it. That would have remade my brains and my life. The treatment that you planned needed some time. I cannot imagine how I would have got through that weekend. I cannot imagine. Had you plotted it all? Your note reached me too soon. That same day, Friday afternoon, posted in the morning. The prevalent devils expedited it. That was one more straw of ill luck drawn against you by the post office and added to your load. I moved fast through the snow-blue February London twilight, wept with relief when you opened the door, a huddle of riddles in solution, precocious tears that failed to interpret to me, failed to divulge their real import. But what did you say over the smoking shards of that letter, so carefully annihilated, so calmly, that let me release you and leave you to blow its ashes off your plan, off the ashtray against which you would lean for me to read the doctor's phone number? My escape had become such a hunted thing, sleepless, hopeless, all its dreams exhausted, only wanting to be recaptured, only wanting to drop out of its vacuum. 2 days of dangling nothing. 2 days gratis. 2 days in no calendar, but stolen from no world, beyond actuality, feeling, or name. My love life grabbed it, my numbed love life with its 2 mad needles embroidering their rows, piercing and tugging at their tapestry, their bloody tattoo somewhere behind my navel, treading that morass of emblazon, 2 mad needles crisscrossing their stitches, selecting among my nerves for their colors, refashioning me inside my own skin, each refashioning the other with their self-caricatures, their obsessed in and out, 2 women each with their needle. That night, my Della Robbia, Susan, I moved with the circumspection of a flame in a fuse. My whole fury was an abandoned effort to blow up the old globe where shadows bent over my telltale track of ashes. I raced from and from, faced backwards, a film reversed. Towards what? We went to Rugby Street, where you and I began. Why did we go there? Of all places, why did we go there? Perversity in the artistry of our fate adjusted its refinements for you, for me, and for Susan. Solitaire played by the minotaur of that maze, even included Helen in the ground-floor flat. You had noted her, a girl for a story. You never met her, few ever met her, except across the ears and raving mask of her Alsatian. You had not even glimpsed her. You had only recoiled when her demented animal crashed its weight against her door as we slipped through the hallway and heard it choking on infinite German hatred. That Sunday night she eased her door open, its few permitted inches. Susan greeted the black eyes, the unhappy, overweight, lovely face that peeped out across the little chain. The door closed. We heard her consoling her jailer inside her cell, its kennel, where, days later, she gassed her ferocious Cupo and herself. Susan and I spent that night in our wedding bed. I had not seen it since we lay there on our wedding day. I did not take her back to my own bed. It had occurred to me, your weekend over, you might appear. A surprise visitation. Did you appear to tap at my dark window? So I stayed with Susan, hiding from you in our own wedding bed. the same from which within 3 years she would be taken to die in that same hospital where, within 12 hours, I would find you dead. Monday morning I drove her to work in the city, then parked my van north of Euston Road, and returned to where my telephone waited. What happened that night, inside your hours, is as unknown as if it never happened. What accumulation of your whole life, like effort unconscious, like birth pushing through the membrane of each slow second into the next, happened only as if it could not happen, as if it was not happening. How often did the phone ring there in my empty room, you hearing the ring in your receiver? At both ends, the fading memory of a telephone ringing in a brain as if already dead. I count how often you walked to the phone booth at the bottom of St. George's Terrace. You are there whenever I look, just turning out of Fitzroy Road, crossing over between the heaped-up banks of dirty sugar. In your long black coat, with your plait coiled up at the back of your hair, you walk, unable to move or wake, and are already nobody walking by the railings under Primrose Hill, towards the phone booth that can never be reached, before midnight, after midnight, again, 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 and near dawn again. At what position of the hands on my watch face did your last attempt, already deeply past my being able to hear it, shake the pillow of that empty bed? A last time lightly touch at my books and my papers. By the time I got there, my phone was asleep, the pillow innocent. My room slept, already filled with the snow-lit morning light. I lit my fire. I had got out my papers, and I had started to write when the telephone jerked awake in a jabbering alarm, remembering everything. It recovered in my hand. Then a voice, like a selected weapon or a measured injection, coolly delivered its 4 words deep into my ear. Your wife is dead.